Okay, so just processing some topics that I was just reviewing while I was working on some other craft projects that I was doing. So, just getting a variety of different opinions, brushing up on some theories that I've somewhat been aware of pertaining to, things along the lines of certain versions of interpretation of socialism or Marxism or feudalism or, things along those lines, capitalism, private property, the history of the collapse of feudalism, and just some quick notes, just kind of opening those mental files, I guess. And at some level, I'm pondering this idea that eventually it could be that we'll get to the point where we realize there's some function possibly built into simply how we exist that has these various functions, and then this is why it keeps resurfacing within cycles of humanity and our experiences, the parameters by which we live in, even if we don't fully understand all of those things. So anyway, that's just kind of what's in my mind when I'm thinking about these patterns of development and heights of systems, and then decline, and having not yet solved for the thing or the various things. And so then the question that I start thinking about, as a reminder, I mostly approach this from examining religion and the scriptural story and seeing if it kind of stands the test of time. I had entered into that for my own curiosities, just trying to see how to interpret it from my cultural historical experience. And so eventually getting to the point of looking at it from systems and these various interactions and whatnot, because that's also very much part of our cultural historical experience, is looking at the system and the effects and whatnot. So I just being reminded of, like it kind of gets referenced in terms of systems where we have capitalism versus communism, right? And all these different versions of those, or what does that mean? And people trying to interpret and define their terms and stuff like that. And as I was listening to, and I've heard little bits and pieces of it, but it was actually a good summary explaining how some of these versions, these systems, had a effect on, like the oppression of women, or in a sense kind of commodifying the aspect of the role of women as birth givers and whatnot, and various dynamics in relation to that in terms of how to build communities and whatnot. And it went through this summary of the different stages of the effects on women, and various times of systems that lose control over certain roles, and anyway, so it's just good. I've heard that stuff before, and you can't help but hear certain interpretive religious connotations within that. And so it's not as though I deny those aspects of getting to the point of developing women's rights and whatnot. Just kind of like repeating how when people study systems, there is that sense where there is truth that there's the toxic masculine and the toxic feminine in certain cycles during times that we find ourselves in, and certain power struggles and whatnot. And it just seems that we kind of shift, right? The pendulum swings, and then we still, go through history and don't quite resolve it, right? So that's just what part of the curiosity that I'm thinking about and considering. At this point, it does seem like, well, let's see. I'll just finish that. I was going to say at this point, it does seem like there's some curious things I see about some forms or some stages of capitalism. where it can kind of select for different types of growth and systems and whatnot. I also, though, was listening to some versions of socialists explaining why, basically refuting claims against socialism. And it is interesting, in making reference to history and certain closed systems and certain effects of control over systems, you do tend to you do see that happen throughout history, different versions of closed systems or weaponized systems against certain select target groups and whatnot. And then the idea of what it means to work together in some sort of social dynamic to make things more accessible and whatnot. But then it also gets into gauging the economy and certain effects and what selects for what, and just all of these various factors. Anyway, though, as I was thinking about it and I was kind of going down the rabbit hole a little bit, just listening to a variety of different versions of people's perspective, I kind of stopped for a minute because I was just getting too much info. There was this, it was all very interesting, but it's just a lot as I was just working on other stuff throughout the evening. Something that was interesting as a reminder was just hearing from a legal standpoint the definitions of private property, because you do hear people summarize things like capitalism and communism, and some of the what they resist with capitalism is that which does away with or abolishes private property. And so capitalism is built from certain rights and access to obtain private property. And then, the whole arguments that go along with that. And then you had various ones defining their terms, or not really defining their terms, but making reference to different ways to look at it, as there's private property and then personal property, certain things that are your personal possession that don't affect, say for instance, like some types of private property affect certain types of investment and whatnot, whereas there's some things that are just your personal property, say like your toothbrush, or that was one of the comparisons that they made, where it's just yours, like that's yours. Anyway, though, but in terms of switching from the philosophical aspect and listening to the legalities of definitions of private property was interesting, because they said private property is a peculiar entity to define, because it's not a definition. Let's see, how did he say it? Private property isn't something, it's kind of defined by excluding things, not really just the attributes of the thing. It's like it's defined on what others don't get to do in terms of the entity, right? The property, like trespass and stuff like that. And so it was just kind of interesting listening to that perspective. And anyway, so a whole range of things, thinking about all of these different definitions and viewpoints in terms of this shared space in Earth and our human condition and our resources that we find ourselves trying to solve for. Another thing, though, that he was saying about the more legal definitions of private property was something to the effect of property has something to do with you in relation to the rest of the world. Like it's a certain type of defining something in relation to the rest of the world, and then it's what you exclude or what's excluded, because it's this type of shared space. So it just the whole idea, I always thought philosophically the idea of private property was interesting. It does seem to be more of like, at some level, a time sequence, because who can really own property forever, right? And it's so interesting too, because of course there's some just the realities of property, right? But there's other aspects of it is kind of a vague notion where how, like what's the depth that you own this property, what's the height. I mean, there are places in cities where they do have like a certain height, like in the skyline and stuff, and places where you can dig. But anyway, just the whole idea, the strange aspect of solving for these human societal equations or conundrums, right? How we exist, where we exist, to what extent, in relation to the effect on others, in relation to creation and stuff like that. Anyway, though, as I was listening to all of these variety of perspectives, and there's still so much more from so many different angles to review, but I started to think, okay, I'm going to take a break for a minute because there was just so much info you can absorb. And so then I started to think, to me, at this point, and I'll sleep on it and maybe I'll have a different opinion later, but at this point I was thinking it kind of summarizes in some level of religion, like ideology or religion, like belief in God, like what what your interpretation of God is, and gender the gender conundrum, which involves a lot of things like desire, biological connection, vulnerabilities of the childbirth stage and the protection stage in terms of gender. But then also, if you look at the history of how certain systems were built in relation to the control measures of gender, just a variety of other things. But anyway, so religion, gender, and then I was thinking resources, right? Religion, gender, and resources. There could be other things fall into those categories. But it seems kind of summarized within them. I guess because within religion is this notion of the creator and that which we, like how we were created, or the question of that. Because I was also thinking a lot of people get into the idea of profit and gauging certain types of profit. We get into these economic systems and I'm I'm not trying to get into the idea of like let's get out of the idea of making a profit and stuff like that, but just looking at the numbers, just seeing it more as like, all right, if we turn the knobs here, if we turn the knobs there, what do we get? So another thing that I was just questioning was this idea of profit, right? Is it really supposed to be a part of the equation ultimately in the grand scheme, if we get on track toward what the human condition is going towards? Of course, in the midst of where we find ourselves, we are in systems where there's certain competitions to make profit, and you kind of have to play the game, and you're stuck in it to some degree, right? But also, though, is just kind of pondering, is it always supposed to be like that? Is it supposed to be profit? What would be the measuring, the measurement of what profit is trying to do, right? I mean, I guess at some level, like in making a profit, you're trying to make a living. You're trying to, in some ways, maybe you want to get wealthy. Sometimes you're just trying to make a living. In relation to that, you would imagine there would be some level of affordability and connection, meeting some need in the public, right? And so you're getting something back for whatever that, product is. And so at some level within your life, you're trying to like make a profit. And what do you do with that profit? So you're able to, have some level of choice in where you live and what you get to do, and certain resources that will be to your disposal or available to you. And then, maybe certain levels of entertainment and stuff like that. But at some level, so I was thinking about that, and I was imagining, well, it kind of seems like if you break it down, though, and it's not just profit, it's some aspect in life seems to be that there's a growth mechanism. Something about our lives wants to grow and resolve things and solve certain things about life. And we also want experiences so that we can do that. Experiences and growth and availability to resources. So anyway, that was just something I was thinking about in terms of questioning the idea of profit. And because something that people have concern about in terms of the stage of capitalism is that, there could be some forces that help it to be more profitable and whatnot, or this competitive market. And there is something, of benefit in our society that we get from that. But then there's also getting to the point where we have to start thinking, though, is that the ultimate direction, though? Is like continual profit? Or are we missing the point as to why we would want to have some level of profit? Is there not really growth? Are we not really resolving the human condition in ourselves? And is it beyond, necessary resources and stuff? But anyway, so just thinking of things like that, just kind of sorting these in my mind. And the idea of excess, I think, is something that people have issue with some forms of capitalism. And just the, people have these arguing points where they want to combat communism. And I'm not saying that, I've talked about that before. I'm not saying that I agree with communism in some of the sense that people propose. I've explained that before, certain levels of safety net and societal supports and whatnot. But yeah, I do have concern about some forms of rampant capitalism and just continual growth measures and incentivizing continuous competition for increased profits and whatnot. And it just starts to seem that there needs to be some other measures that we're gauging success by. And so I'm not saying that some forms of what people are trying to theorize about capitalism can't still be a good function, but could there be some other type of like a mechanism that it's like, kind of gauging, So anyway, thinking about that and yeah, kind of getting back to that summary that I was entertaining in my mind about looking at these systems and their different approaches and conflicts with this mystery of religion or God, religion, resources, and gender. There does seem to be some things to think about in terms of, this question of private property. I still haven't gotten to a point where it's situated in a way that I feel like I've found my viewpoint that I'm going to settle on. I feel like I'm just trying on various ideas, and I see the significance of it. Like, for instance, just like in my own life, I feel like there's a sense of, even though I live very modest, there is a sense of more of a peace in that I've chosen. I knew that I was going to be focused on a lot of these various things that don't always pay, just being an idea person and sharing, there's kind of that joke that being, doing philosophical work doesn't always pay out. And so I knew that I just kind of it was just some things that I wanted to do, and I also just felt significant in my life to take the time to consider. Anyway, though, simplified my life a lot, and I just found over the years there is a sense of a stability that you get from having some sense of a little bit more control over your baseline, I guess. I've been in other situations, through my younger years of apartments that cost more, or other situations and conditions. And so I do see the significance of, for the ability to be in a place where you have a little bit more control over your property and whatnot. And, I'd also been in places where the cost was going up, and sometimes some of the different fees could go up. And so I do understand at some basic level, without overthinking it, the ability to have an affordable home base is pretty significant in relation to other aspects of things. And then I can also see at that very basic level times when there were times where we were living in more of an urban setting, and you're kind of at the whim of certain prices and whatnot, whether it be for apartments, and there's other costs that can accumulate in relation to that. It depends on if you have like a washer and dryer, if you have to go somewhere to do that, and those types of fees, and transportation, and a lot of just like life fees and whatnot. And so at some level you can start to see how things could snowball, right? Even things out of your control, other factors maybe that are somewhat in your control, and then a variety of other factors, it could just snowball to where next thing you know, there's just this accumulated activity and cost in relation to your life and your routine and whatnot. And so I could see how eventually it's nice to have something within the system to say, okay, what can I do? Like if you get to the point, right? If you get to the point where you think, okay, what can I do? Where can I cut back on my life, my energy input, output, and baseline, or whatever. And you could think, well, maybe I could cut back on this or that, But in some ways, unless you have some way to gauge slowing it down, or what it seems like anyway, at the baseline, say like with property, or thinking, there really isn't a lot of choice at this point. It seems like housing isn't that affordable to minimize or to slow it down. Maybe it could be a variety of things, like, you see young people living out of cars and living in vans and kind of just moving from place to place, and they save money in that kind of way. But then they have to strategize where they can or cannot park, or, where they can charge their car if that's the type of vehicle they have. And then there's the idea of small home living, like tiny homes, or just medium-sized. Or there's sharing a house with others, or a similar version to that where it's multi-generational living, or property sharing, stuff like that. So you see people, and so what they tend to be doing at some level when they're doing that is, maybe sharing the cost of living, and then working up their life skills and their growth, right? Their growth and development. And so it does seem like at some level in practice, what people are trying to do is they're both trying to have growth and resources, and then access to certain experiences. And it just seems like those aspects help us, as a part of our experience, that we expose ourselves to a variety of different experiences. It seems like some level of balance there, because some people will just chase experiences and they're not examining enough and they're not really growing. At some level there's growth though, because it seems like when you're introduced to things you grow, you absorb some of it, and it becomes part of your mental files and your calculations and whatnot. But then you also then need to balance out resources, and if those things get out of line, then if resources are rampant and it's difficult to chase it, then you're not really, getting other thorough experiences and growth. And so, I don't know, it just seems like there's something to that. And, maybe that kind of goes along with these ideas of, so if you're thinking about growth, resources, and experiences, and then this question of God or religion, or God, gender, and resources, it all just kind of goes together to some degree. But anyway, just some things I was thinking about. I know there's more. I covered a lot of content. There's more that I want to listen to from a variety of different perspectives, but I guess I'll just leave it at that for now. I'm still pondering this idea of different types of, I guess just bringing balance to that, the rampant weaponizing of gender roles, and then looking at it from the perspective of religion is, in my estimation, isn't so much that we're trying to force this like certain version of the male female, as much as just having individuals become better balanced versions of themselves in relation to society and whatnot. And then from there they could develop their like specified relationships or what have you. But seems like we're finally getting to the point though where we're able to kind of get our minds around this idea of religion and kind of loosening the hold on some of these gender approaches, and then looking at universal human rights and whatnot, and certain rights that are offered to various ones in terms of basic levels of safety and respect, and shared living, in the public aspect of things, and looking at examining our lives and certain human values. But it seems like now we're at that stage where we're asking in terms of systems, right? In terms of systems, because it does seem like we're kind of negotiating between, like, okay, it's not just communism and capitalism as like extreme masculine, extreme feminine, where communism undergirds the ability for any property and makes people, it's oversimplified, but like totally dependent on the whims of a system, and then capitalism controls various ones through enclosures of property and makes people adhere to the whims of the system, so they can become these power entities, right? Certain leverages of certain powers against. But if we're getting to the point where we can say, all right, there should be some corrective measures to capitalism in those forms, and some corrective measures to communism in those forms, if we are trying to have a consensus of what it means to utilize some of the mechanisms of capitalism that select for the stages of developing the growth mechanism within humans, because we're not just trying to reach each other's basic resource needs, we're also trying to solve for what it is to experience stages of growth, and then rewarding or helping to support, I guess, those levels of growth in relation to the public, in relation to also people being prepared to be able to be a part of that, growth in the market. In some ways, some mechanisms seem to help with that. As I was saying, though, I don't know that it always has to be profit in the same type of way, but some sort of growth mechanism within what people seem to suggest about capitalism. But then at the same time, not doing that in such a way where it creates closures for people to not have basic resources met in terms of being integrated into those stages of eventual growth and whatnot. Anyway, there's other things that I've said about that, and I do still intend to watch some of these other videos and maybe comment on them and whatnot. So anyway, that's just not my whole argument along those lines. But what I was getting to, though, is if we have come to somewhat of a, like, being open to the idea of not really maybe a socialism where it interrupts that growth pattern that people are making reference to in terms of capitalism, but meeting people's needs and maybe getting rid of the excesses of certain loopholes and whatnot, and allowing for some of the aspects of the capitalistic gain of choice by just giving certain forms of money directly to people, so that the aspect of choice and growth can still be enacted with the certain types of allocations and whatnot. Anyway, though, along those lines, though, I think I'm still considering, though, the resources aspect of it, and not just allocation of basic resources in the midst of these markets and whatnot and systems, but the idea of, like I was saying before, one of the aspects of, like, capitalism, like rampant consumerism and whatnot, and rampant, excessive, weaponized, competitive, infiltrated profits, which coincide with excessive consumerism. It doesn't solve for the other mechanisms, right? It's not really solving for proper experiences. It's kind of hiding from experiences. It's hiding from growth because it's based on these, like, marketing schemes a lot of times. And so we're not really solving for the other aspects of it. So we have this rampant excesses. And so then it seems that it's looking at resources. And what's the question for, the sustainability of resources, a system that solves for that? Because there could be, as we were saying, maybe we've reached the point where, okay, there's some concessions about some forms of what people attribute with the growth mechanisms within capitalism, and refining certain behavioral dynamics of people. And then, the possibilities of looking at different ways for better allocations of basic support and integration for groups. But we're not really solving or seeming to solve for the resources. It's rampant, right? I talked about that before, though, in terms of what also kind of really turns up the knobs on excesses of resources and raising the bar along those lines. It seems to be the forever wars and the expenses that coincide with, the cost of war and whatnot. The cost in so many ways. But yeah, just, I guess, along the lines of that baseline of the resources and sustainability, then is also goes along with that question of private property and in what way. And so anyway, I think I'll leave it at that. I'm still thinking about these things, and there's other topics that I just kind of want to mull over and whatnot and spend more time thinking about. But anyway, just gonna leave it at that for now.